In this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to the Richardson Maturity Model for REST APIs. Here's the rundown of what we are going to cover in this lesson. We're going to talk about the Richardson Maturity Model. I'll show you what it is, what are the actual levels in the maturity model, and where REST APIs fit on this scale. The Richardson Maturity Model was named after Leonard Richardson, and it serves as a scale to grade the RESTful maturity of your API. There are 4 levels on this scale, starting from level 0, which is also called the swamp of POX, where POX stands for plain old XML. Then we have level 1, where we introduce the concept of resources to our API. At level 2, we can start talking about HTTP semantics by introducing HTTP methods and status codes. And at level 3, we have hypermedia or HateOS. Most HTTP APIs that are currently running in production are somewhere around level 2 on the Richardson Maturity Model. In rare occasions, you will also see APIs on level 3, which means they implement hypermedia, and this makes them proper REST APIs. Also, based on my years of experience of building web APIs, the majority of them would fall under level 2, which means they didn't implement hypermedia. Now, let's take a look at a few examples to try to understand what the API surface looks like on each of these levels. We'll start from level 0, which is the swamp of POX, or plain old XML, and this is basically a web API that uses HTTP for RPC style calls. RPC stands for Remote Procedure Call. A typical example of this would be some SOAP services, where you expose just one resource on your entire API, let's call it the habit service, and all of the requests use the post HTTP method. Now, based on the contents of the message, you determine if this is a request to retrieve a set of habits, to retrieve the entries, to add or remove a habit. So at this level, the contents of the message carry the semantics of what you want to achieve with the API request. Moving one level above, we get to level 1, which is where we introduce the concept of resources. And we said in the previous lesson that resources can be anything that we can attach a name to and that we can uniquely identify. So in this context, we introduce resources instead of having one universal endpoint. So let's say we have an endpoint for managing the habits resource, we have an endpoint for managing the users for the entries of a given habit, but we still aren't properly using the HTTP protocol, and all of our requests to the API are POST requests. So we still have to use the contents of the message to determine what we want to do with a particular resource. On level 2, we extend the resources that we currently have, and we start using HTTP methods and status codes correctly together with the resources to start describing our API endpoints. So we have the habits as our collection resource, and then if we send a GET request, it means we want to retrieve the entire collection. The response to this request would typically be the 200 OK status code containing the contents of this resource. If we send a POST request to this resource, the habits collection, our intent is to create another element in this collection. The response could be 200 OK, it could be 201 created with the URI of the newly created resource present in the location header. Then if we send a patch request to this resource, which is a specific habit instance in the collection, our intent is to perform a partial update. The response status code could be 204 no content if the update was successful, or it could be 404 not found if the resource doesn't exist, or it did exist but it was deleted in the meantime. We're also going to discuss what is the proper status code to return when a resource isn't found. Let's just assume for now that 404 not found is the correct one to return. Lastly, we have the delete HTTP method, which we send to this URI, and the intent is to delete the resource from the collection. The response can again be 204 no content in case of a successful request, or 404 not found if we aren't able to locate the resource. So at level 2 of the Richardson Maturity Model, we start supporting HTTP semantics by using the correct HTTP methods and returning the correct status codes. Finally, at level 3, we introduce hypermedia to our resource representations, and we start using hypermedia links to drive the behavior of our application. So if we send a GET request to our API, for a given habit with a specific identifier, which represents the URI of this resource, we will get back a representation of this resource. And at level 3, the representation is also going to include a set of hypermedia links, which are going to help us determine what are the next available operations on this resource. So we could have a hypermedia link to fetch the resource. Again, We could also have a link to update the resource or delete it, and if there are any other operations that we can do on this resource, we can also include them here. Now, what's really interesting with Hypermedia is that you can also use them to drive business rules. Let's say that regular users in your system shouldn't be allowed to delete resources. What you can do is check the user's permissions, and if they aren't an administrator, then you can go ahead and omit the Hypermedia link that represents the delete operation. On the user interface, you can use the Hypermedia links to render the available actions, and if you notice that the delete operation is missing, you can simply deactivate or not render at all the delete button that could be used to perform this operation. And now we can continue extending the Hypermedia concept further. Let's say we have some more complex business rules that determine how our resources can interact. For example, let's say I can delete a habit if it has at least one entry inside. I can go ahead and check if I created a specific entry. Let's say the entry says I was coding for 30 minutes or I was watching this course for 15 minutes today. That could be an entry for a specific habit, and a habit could be me wanting to improve as a software developer. So we can introduce a business rule that if there is at least one entry for a business habit, then you can no longer delete it. But then we can introduce a different business rule where we can say, okay, you can no longer delete a habit, but you are allowed to archive it. So here's a new operation, let's call it archive. This is going to be the URL where you can send your request to archive a habit, and then this is going to have different behavior from deleting a habit. Of course, we're going to explore all of this and more in the Hypermedia and HateOS chapter. The main takeaway from the Richardson maturity model is that level 3 is required to build a REST API. This is also something that Fielding states in his work, which is why most of the web APIs you see out there don't qualify as REST APIs or RESTful APIs, even though they are sometimes called that. The most correct classification would be to use the term HTTP API. And then if you start using Hypermedia, then we can start talking about a RESTful API. That being said, this doesn't mean that HTTP APIs are bad. I believe I also said this in the previous lesson, because this is an important point that I want you to understand. All of the principles that we are going to discuss inside of this course also apply to HTTP APIs. So if you don't see value in Hypermedia, then you don't really have to use it. Although I suggested you at least consider it, and I'm sure that by the end of this course, you will start to see the value of using Hypermedia to drive your application's behavior. If you want to explore this topic further, there is an excellent book that I recommend that you check out. It's called RESTful Web APIs, and it was written by Leonard Richardson, Mike Amundsen, and Sam Ruby. Now, in this lesson, we talked about the Richardson maturity model, which was named after Leonard Richardson. There is also the Amundsen maturity model, which was coined by Mike Amundsen, and this maturity model deals with representations in a RESTful API, whereas the Richardson maturity model deals with respecting HTTP semantics and the REST constraints. And this brings us to the end of the current lesson. In the next lesson, I want to introduce you to API First. In this lesson, I want to introduce you to API First, which is an approach for developing APIs where the APIs are treated as first-class citizens. I don't intend this to be a definitive guide on API First, I just want to bring this on your radar, and I'm also going to be including some useful resources if you want to learn more that are going to be under this video. So what is API First? It's an approach, a design methodology that prioritizes APIs in the development process. This means that we start thinking about APIs and designing them before we write even a single line of code. This could be an interesting exercise if you want to build a RESTful API. In the next lesson, I'm going to introduce you to the application that we're going to be building as part of this course, and a good use of your time would be thinking about how you would design the API surface for the application that we are going to build. What would be your API's resources? How would you organize the URLs? What are you going to return in your representations? How is the client going to integrate with your API? And this opens up a lot of questions that wouldn't come up if we just started writing the code for our domain, implementing some business logic or database interactions, and then figuring out how to expose an API on top of an existing implementation. API First takes an opposite approach, where we first map out the API surface, and then we actually build the implementation. The focus here is on the needs of the API consumers from the start. These are going to be our client applications like web apps, mobile applications, but it's not exclusive to that. Our client applications could also be other APIs developed and managed by another team that for some reason needs to integrate with the RESTful API that we are offering. So this is something you should definitely consider when designing your API. Think about how your consumers are going to be using it. Another advantage of API first design when we apply it across an organization is that we can ensure uniformity across different APIs and services. Let's say we are a large company exposing a RESTful API so that clients can interact with our services. If we were to let each team develop their own best practices and how they want to expose the API surface, we're going to end up with a very ununiform API and the consumer experience is going to deteriorate. This is why API first prioritizes developing the APIs, and part of this could be defining some best practices or guidelines that you want to follow as a company. So this is a bit more food for thought. And one more point I want to make with API First is that it encourages the collaboration between your development teams and the stakeholders. I know that we may be straying to the business side of things, but this is something that I always want to emphasize because at the end of the day, the majority of the APIs that we build are there to run a business. For example, the Stripe API manages one of the largest payment platforms in the world, and so does the PayPal API and the GitHub API and the Twitter or X API. All of these APIs are there to power the underlying business, so it's definitely important to take into consideration what are the business requirements that we want to uphold with the API that we are developing. So that's another reason to consider what your API surface will look like at the start of the development cycle rather than at the end after you have already baked in so many constraints with your implementation. So as I said at the start, this is just a brief introduction into API First. There is a lot more to cover here, which I'm not going to dive into, so I'm going to leave some useful learning material right under this video, and you can go ahead and explore it if you want to learn more. And now we can move into our next lesson where I'm going to introduce you to the application and REST API that we are going to build as part of this course.